The Penguin is finally over, and boy, what a ride that was. I'll admit, I don't tend to prefer stories focused on villains, but somehow, this show made me fall in love with this monster, only to leave me hating him like few villains can really be hated. But why is that? Besides basic phenomenal writing and award worthy performances, I want to look at what sets this story apart from the sea of other projects that have tried, and most often failed, to take established villains and make them compelling as the star of their own show. But before I get into it, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now, without further ado, let's dive into it. To understand what the Penguin, and Joker before it for that matter, do so well, we need to understand what makes this genre so hard to do justice. What do Venom, Morbius, Madam Web, Loki, Black Adam, Suicide Squad, Peacemaker, Maleficent, and Cruella all have in common? Yes, they're all movies or shows about villains, but while some are decent stories, they all suffer from a similar problem. We've been making movies and shows about these kinds of characters for a while now because people love villains, though maybe not necessarily the ones Sony is using. There's a reason we say a hero's only as good as their villain. However, the best villains tend to be designed around their respective hero. They're meant to complement and challenge the character we're rooting for. So as much as we love villains, we generally love them for the role they serve in someone else's story. They're meant to be the hero's foil in some way. But studios gotta make money somehow, so that's not gonna stop them from trying to give these popular characters their own movies one way or another. So what do you do when you take the villain of someone else's story and make them the star of their own movie? Well, for the writers of most of Hollywood's formulaic movies, the obvious answer is to make them the hero. After all, every movie's gotta follow a hero who fights a mustache-twirling villain, so if we're gonna be following this character, he's gotta fit the hero mold and face his own mustache-twirling villain, otherwise how can we make a movie about him? What this does is it reduces the villain to the anti-hero, and often takes away what made the character so compelling as a villain in the first place. This speaks to just how hard it is for most writers to do villains well. It's hard enough when they're just the antagonist in somebody else's story, but at least then it's forgivable because it's the hero the audience is invested in. But when the writer is forced to put that same villain front and center in his own story, they've got to make them compelling and sympathetic somehow, and in most cases, the only answer anyone can come up with is to make them look like a hero by comparing them to someone even worse. Venom may horrifically maul and devour tons of people, but hey, he's taken down other symbiotes who would maul and devour even more people, I guess, so he's the good guy now. Black Adam keeps telling us he's not a hero, but that's as far as the writers go with the moral ambiguity, and they sure seem to want us to see him as a hero because they can't help but pit him against an even bigger villain, instead of having the guts to make him actually take down the good guys and end the film as a serious threat to the Justice League or something, like I was hoping. For all Hollywood's supposed love of moral complexity, all they seem to know how to do is give us less heroic and inspiring protagonists, without actually challenging us with real moral complexity. Now, I will note that, while I do find that in general the trope of turning villains into anti-heroes is often lazy, it is possible to do so decently well if you know what you're doing. The trick is just to actually give the character depth and growth, either framing their evil actions in a new light, or retconning those actions if you really don't want them to be that bad. For example, let's compare Maleficent to Cruella. While both use the same trope, one does so much more effectively than the other. Maleficent is a reimagining of the original tale, which gives her a backstory to provide context for her initial act of cursing Aurora, then changes the ending to give her a redemptive arc in which she saves Aurora. Whether or not you prefer this to the original story, it works on its own because it reimagines her character to give her depth, explaining certain actions in the original story while changing others to make her less irredeemably evil. The difference between this and Cruella is that the latter doesn't explain the horrible things she does in 101 Dalmatians, or retcon them. It is meant to be a prequel, so it doesn't change the events of the original at all. It merely presents itself as a backstory for the villain. However, the only thing this Cruella has in common with the puppy-murdering psychopath we know is her name and her hair. The creators were just scraping the bottom of the barrel for films they could make out of their old IPs, and they knew how iconic of a villain Cruella is, so they decided to give her the anti-heroine treatment as well. But with no idea how to make us root for someone whose defining trait is the thing so intrinsically associated with cartoonish villainy that it's become a joke, they just ignore that whole part of her character and make up a new one. pitting her against someone just as evil as the old Cruella in hopes we'd forget who the supposed hero of the movie is. This is, to me, perhaps the epitome of Hollywood's anti-hero problem. Thankfully, it's a problem that Matt Reeves hasn't fallen for. Like Joker before it, the Penguin knew its titular character was a villain, and didn't shy away from that. It didn't change the character to make him any more sympathetic, nor did it make his antagonist so cartoonishly evil that he looks heroic by comparison. The show knew what made Oz such a compelling character, and that was his villainy. He's a monster, and that's why we love to watch him, to see what makes him tick, why he is the way he is, and perhaps, in the desperate hope, we can find some glimmer of humanity in his filthy soul. We want to root for him, even though we're not supposed to. The writing is so good at showing us just enough to make us care about him, without making him any less of a villain. Sure, he's got a charm and charisma that makes him magnetically likable, but beyond that, we get to know him through the eyes of the people in his life, forming a vicarious relationship with him through them. And perhaps for their sake more than anything else, we want him to be who he presents himself to them to be. Victor is our main stand-in throughout this story, and it's through him that we see glimpses of hope for Oz as he shows Vic his own form of compassion and affection. Like Victor, we're drawn in by his promises of greatness, his enormous ambition, and we're flattered by his praise, eager for his approval. Even as he screws over everyone else around him for his own gain time and time again, we can't help but fall for his guise as long as he keeps it up for Vic. Until we finally see him vulnerable. We finally see him broken underneath. And then we're swiftly punished. Punished for having seen past his facade, for having gotten too close. Punished for having cared, for having loved a monster, incapable of loving in return. Even his relationship with his mother gets similarly turned on his head. Their relationship seems loving at first, and their moments together are some of the most touching in the show. Seeing them dancing together, we think maybe Oz is human, maybe he is capable of love, if only for this one person in his life. But as the story goes on, we realize how toxic their relationship really is. We realize this man, this devil, as Frances herself calls him, isn't capable of loving. He's just desperate for her approval, her attention, and he'll do anything to win it. He already had her love, but that wasn't enough. He had to have it all. He had to have her all to himself. He had to be on top of the world, but it would never be enough until he had her validation to cap it all. Not that she'd always withheld her validation, but broken by her grief for her sons, overcome with depression and seeing him as her way out, she used him. She knew who he was, what he was, but finding herself unable to do the unthinkable by turning him over to Rex, even she was drawn in by his silver tongue, by his promises. She saw what he was capable of, and she decided to train him. She groomed him and pushed him to do whatever he had to do to give her the life she wanted, even as she came to hate him for it. So perhaps it's fitting that in the end he gave her the life he originally promised her, even if that meant betraying his later promise to give her what she really wanted. Too weak to let her go, and too selfish to sacrifice his own delusion and validation for her happiness. This is a show that plays with you, that leads you along and keeps you desperately searching for that reason to love the Penguin. It gives you just enough glimpses to give you hope that the man you can't help but admire is worth rooting for, before inevitably snuffing it out, ending the final episode in the darkest, most disgusting way possible, making you hate this man all the more because you wanted to love him, because he fooled you into caring for him, and then hurt you like only those you let close ever can. And so he has set himself up to be the ultimate villain for the next installment of the Batman. That is how you make a show about a villain. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments what you loved about the Penguin, as well as your thoughts on the trope of turning villains into anti-heroes in general. What are some of your favorite villains you've seen or would like to see as protagonists of their own story? I look forward to joining you in the conversation. Until next time, never stay silent.